So why am I more autistic now that I've received my autism diagnosis? Hi, I'm Phil and I'm a late diagnosed autistic older adult. Many autistic people report that they feel more autistic after being diagnosed. So I wanted to dig into my experience and share how being diagnosed with autism has changed how autistic I feel and look to other people. So firstly, I have to confirm that I absolutely feel more autistic now after being diagnosed with autism last year. So what ways have I noticed in myself that I am more autistic? Firstly, stimming, which is repetitive movements, sounds, or even some repetitive thoughts like counting, and can also include seeking visual stimulation, like watching an object spin around. The purpose of stimming is to help regulate an overstimulated emotional or sensory system. While I have always stimmed, often these have been subtle stims like leg bouncing or biting the inside of my lip. In short, stims that work to regulate my emotional system, but are not noticeable to other people. As part of understanding my autism, I have learned through other autistic people that larger stims like hand movements can be more effective to achieve this emotional regulation. So I tried it. And yes, it is true that bigger body movements work well to achieve this end. So I've gone from being someone who would never have done these types of more obvious stims to being someone who now regularly hand flaps in a way that is much more stereotypically autistic. What I've discovered by doing this is that hand flapping is incredibly efficient as a stim in regulating my emotional state. In other words, there is a good reason why many autistic people do it. There are also many aspects to my sensory experience that have also become much more noticeable to me since diagnosis. I've always been very sensitive to sound, but I just put up with the discomfort of being in public because no one else seemed to be bothered by it. Now that I understand that this sensory discomfort is due to being autistic, I am now much more aware of sound in my everyday experience. Whereas before I would go to the shops and find the noise and things like background music annoying, now because I understand why it's annoying, it has become so much more overstimulating than ever before. The good news here, however, is that because I am more self-aware, I can do something about it, which is wearing modern high-quality earplugs. I have the loop earplugs, which I can modify to block as much sound as possible, or by taking out the insert, they can just reduce sound by a smaller amount so I can still hear conversation in a noisy environment, like a restaurant, while still reducing general background noise. I now always wear these when I have to do the shopping, and it does make my world noticeably calmer in these environments. Similar to sound is brightly lit places. Whereas I knew I was sensitive before my diagnosis, I now am acutely aware of this and always have sunglasses on hand. Touch is another sensory aspect I am now much more aware of, in particular clothing. I always knew that certain clothing was uncomfortable to me, but would maybe try to put up with it. Now I will try to accommodate myself as best as possible. An example here is that I've always found I was uncomfortable in the evenings when relaxing, particularly my legs. I don't like wearing pants. Whereas previously I might put on some track pants and still feel uncomfortable. Now I've discovered that just wearing sports compression tights is way better, as there is no excess material to get caught around my legs. This slight compression feel also helps with the proprioceptive sense by giving me a sense of where my legs are and where they stop in comparison to the space around me. For a bit more on what proprioception is and how autistic people experience it and the other senses differently, please check out my Introduction to Autism 2-part video. Moving on, a big way that I have noticed that I feel more autistic now is how I respond to social situations. By that, I mean how I respond to being around groups of people in general, including being in public. I am now so much more aware of how being around people and needing to communicate with them is difficult for me. Again, like all the previous points, it was always difficult, but now I understand why. The level of overwhelm is now an order of magnitude higher. This means I'm more likely to just avoid these settings altogether. Now, to clarify here, this does not mean I don't want to have interaction with any other people, but it means that when I do have interactions, I want those to be with the people I want to be with and not with random strangers. So how might other people notice that I appear more autistic since my diagnosis? One possibility here is through my eating habits. Food is another sensory element, and again, while I've always been hugely sensitive to food tastes, textures and smells, I always thought it was because I was just a fussy eater. So I blame myself for that and not want to make a fuss and maybe just try to eat foods placed in front of me to be polite and to avoid any attention that my eating difficulties caused. Now I know this is not because I am just fussy, but because my autistic senses get overwhelmed by food very easily. I will be less likely to try to just be polite to the detriment of my senses, and may be more forthright in refusing food that will cause me discomfort. Actually, I'm much more likely to remove myself altogether from these situations. In a similar way to how I've noticed that I am stimming more outwardly, others have also picked up on this change, which has in no way been negative. Likewise, my other body movements like tics have also become more obvious to others, but I will expand on this a bit later. So why is all this the case? Part of what happens after an autism diagnosis or identification is that we start to connect the dots, in that so many seemingly unrelated traits, behaviours or quirks are in fact all part of either our autism or possibly another related but separate neurodivergence. A few examples here are: I've always curled my toes into bird claws while sitting or standing. I had never considered that this was anything other than a little quirky thing I did that I did not see anyone else doing, but was blown away when I discovered that this is a common hidden stim that autistic people do to help regulate our nervous systems, particularly when around other people. This is just one of many things that even after starting down the autism discovery journey, I would not have expected to be connected. Another quite different example is the fact that I've always had these odd jerky movements that occur occasionally, particularly when anxious or triggered by a thought or memory. Before I even started down the path to discovering my autism, I remember researching Tourette syndrome to see if these little movements could be related, but then discounting that possibility and feeling like a fake for even thinking about it. I knew that I could hide these movements, so I just put the thought aside. Since my diagnosis, however, these movements or tics have become much more prevalent, as I now accept them as a real part of my autism. These are now noticeable to other people, where they were effectively hidden before. A fact to consider here is that many people with Tourette syndrome also are autistic, and likewise many, but not all, autistic people experience Tourette's-like tics, even though they might not meet the diagnostic criteria for Tourette syndrome. I am going to do a video on autistic ticking in the near future to explore this subject in more detail, so if that is of interest to you, please feel free to hit the subscribe button to be notified when that video is released. Another important point to note here is imposter syndrome. This is where we doubt ourselves, and this doubt can happen in many different areas of our lives. An everyday example of imposter syndrome that many neurotypical people can relate to is in our professional lives. We might doubt our ability or our right to be in a certain position, even though we have done the work, produced the results, and have the experience to be in that position. In the context of autism, many of us, somewhere in the process of discovering our autism, doubt whether we are actually autistic, or start to think, I'm not that autistic, or I don't want to wrongly claim this and take away from others who are really autistic. These types of thoughts, while natural, can eat away at our confidence, and in some cases may make someone turn away from the process of following through with an autism identification or diagnosis altogether. Especially if we experience some pushback or, worst case, gaslighting from medical professionals as we try to start down the diagnostic journey. And believe me, this does happen. This self-doubt can make us double down on masking our autism from other people, and even from ourselves. So when we finally do accept that this is the truth, it can lead to a reversal of this masking behaviour. This can be both conscious and unconscious. The outcome is our autistic traits come to the surface. Both the traits we have been hiding for years or even our entire lives, but also this can open the way for new traits to emerge as we start to explore and embrace our new identity. This is where imposter syndrome can bite us, as the natural internal response is, now we are trying to fake or overplay our autistic traits to justify our new autistic identity to ourselves and others. Please be aware that if this is your experience, you're not faking anything. This is a common and natural progression through self-acceptance and understanding. At this point, I would also encourage you not to take other people's comments to heart if they are negative or even just observational in the fact that you are more autistic since diagnosis. As autistic people, we are also more likely to experience rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which means we might internalise these observations of other people as criticism or judgment. This is a normal but challenging part of the autistic experience. One aspect I want to talk about here in isolation because of its importance is capacity. By that I mean my overall capacity to undertake tasks and even just to live. What I have noticed in relation to this is that my overall capacity seems to be diminished from where I thought it was prior to my diagnosis. Now, to be honest, I'm still trying to understand why this is different, but there could be a few factors at play. Firstly, now I understand so much better where my limits are, I am less able or willing to push past those limits, where previously I might have pushed too far and then crashed. Secondly, the whole process of going through this journey of understanding, leading to my diagnosis, has taken a toll on my overall being. Combined with the fact that I am now several years older than before I started this journey, has possibly led to a diminished capacity. Finally, my capacity has always been less than other people because of my autism. And now I know about my autism, I can see it more clearly. The impact of this reduced capacity affects me in several ways, but the one I want to mention here is in regard to employment. Along with guidance from my psychologist, I have come to the realisation that I probably won't have the capacity to go back into regular employment, other than my part-time business. This compares with the fact that I used to run my business alongside a full-time job. But it's all the factors mentioned above that lead into my current level of capacity and current inability to work in a way that others are able to. This obviously creates a financial challenge going forward. And even if I am able to qualify for a disability support pension because of this reduced capacity, and to be clear, autism is clearly a disability, it is not financially equivalent to having a working wage. And again, the imposter syndrome kicks in at this point, with negative self-talk saying things like, "You're just being lazy," or "You're just gaming the system." Everything we've talked about here might lead to the question, would I have been better off not getting a diagnosis, or even coming to an understanding of my autistic nature? While it is true that life has actually gotten more challenging since my diagnosis, and in some ways it feels a bit like I've gone through a period of disintegration, I think that it is far better to know myself accurately through understanding my autism than it would have been to continue to live with the challenges of being autistic, but no understanding as to the root cause of those challenges. That lack of understanding could conceivably have come to some catastrophic outcome at some point later in my life, as the stresses, anxiety, overwhelm, and uncertainty of living as an undiagnosed autistic person in a neurotypical world. So yes, despite the challenges in this journey, I have no doubt, at least for me, it has been a far better outcome than living in ignorance. And to end on, I want to make the point that being outwardly autistic is actually a positive thing as long as the people around us are supportive. It also lets people see that our autism is not something to be afraid of, as we're just regular people whose brain just works a bit differently. So that's it for now. If you found any of this useful or interesting, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. This will help me stay encouraged and keep making more content. Despite a slow start to the year, I have a few videos currently in the writing stage, so I hope to get back into producing more regular content in the coming months. Thanks for watching. See you next time.